So I now would like to introduce the moderator for this session, my colleague and friend, Oz Frankel. Oz is a professor of history and in the history department at the New School for Social Research and at Lang. He was also chairman of the history department here at the New School. His early research and work, and a quite well-received book, was focused on 19th century American and British history. More recently, he is working on Israeli-American relations between 1970 and 1973 for a book tentatively titled Moving in the American Orbit, Israeli-American Encounters at the Turn of the 1970s. And it's with great pleasure that I now give him the microphone to begin the session.
Thank you, Ariane, and thank you for organizing this incredibly important and timely conference. The title of this panel is Targeting Conflicts Between and Within Territories. I think it's a bit too open-ended, too vague and all-encompassing. I guess all conflicts are within territories and outside or between territories. My belief is that the focus of this panel are those conflicts that are fueled by strong and competing ethnic, maybe racial, and national claims. And conflicts that in particular raise issues of human rights and self-determination. Let me introduce the panelist. Berhanu Nega is I'm sorry. I don't want just to hold it as some others did, because then like that I feel a bit like the aging Frank Sinatra. So I'll do my best, Ariane. Berhanu Nega is a professor of economics at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. He has a truly fascinating life story. He was born in Ethiopia. He taught at Bucknell for a few years. In 1994, he returned to his homeland and became involved in the political process over there. In 2005, he was elected mayor of Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. But he was never able to assume this particular role. Instead, he was arrested and spent close to 2 years in jail. He then left the country and continued to be active politically from the United States. He's a founder of different associations, all fighting and arguing for social justice and democracy in Ethiopia. And in 2009, he was actually sentenced to death in absentia. Nina Khrushcheva is a colleague of ours. She's an associate professor in the graduate program of international affairs and associate dean for academic affairs of Milano School of International Affairs at the New School. She's a senior fellow of the World Policy Institute and an editor of and a contributor to Project Syndicate, Association of Newspapers around the world. She's the author of two books. One titled Nabokov, Russia Between Art and Politics, and the other is The Lost Khrushchev, A Journey into the Gulag of the Russian Mind. Nimer Sultany, our third speaker, is a lecturer in public law in the School of Law at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He worked as a human rights lawyer in the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and headed the political monitoring project at Mada Al-Carmel, the Arab Center for Applied Social Research. His publications include The State of Progressive Constitutional Theory, The Paradox of Constitutional Democracy, and the Project of Political Justification, and Citizens Without Citizenship, Israel and the Palestinian Minority. Our fourth and still absent speaker is Todd Gitlin. Professor Gitlin is the chair of the PhD program in communication at Columbia University. is a renowned sociologist, scholar of media and politics, a novelist, and a public intellectual. He published more than 12 books, I believe. I'll just give you a couple of titles. The most recent one, Occupy Nation, The Roots, the Spirit and the Promise of Occupy Wall Street. And the penultimate one, The Chosen People, America, Israel, and the Ordeals of Divine Election. So in terms of regional spread, we have two speakers who will address the very timely and divisive issue of the BDS movement. One speaker focuses on Russia and the Ukraine, I suppose, and the first one on Africa, conflicts in Africa. So without further ado, we'll just begin. I think short presentations, discussion, then we'll open it up for questions and remarks.
Thank you. I have the unenviable task of talking about Africa as if it is one country. So when we talk about African sanctions, it's going to be very difficult to talk about all of them. There are so many sanctions running around in the continent. I was thinking about how to organize this in terms of making sense of the larger questions, whether sanctions are effective or not. So what I thought is first to talk a little bit about the kinds of sanctions that are imposed on a number of African countries, individuals, entities, and group them into three broad categories. The first kind of category is sanctions aimed at stopping armed internal conflicts. There are so many conflicts, as you know, within individual countries. A number of sanctions were imposed on countries to somehow stop these internal conflicts. One category of sanctions is an attempt to shore up the existing state, whatever that state is. The Democratic Republic of Congo's sanction 1493 in 2003, the resolution on Somalia by the United Nations starting from 1992 all the way to 2009. So in these cases, the target could be non-state actors, usually opposition movements, organized armed opposition movements, but also some of the sanctions target countries that support these opposition movements or somehow interfere in the internal conflicts. So one category of sanctions is targeting non-state actors in order to shore up the state. The target could also be all parties to the conflict, including states. The sanction on Sudan in relation to the Darfur conflict, Resolution 1591, 2005, and of course the most recent threat of sanctions not yet imposed on South Sudan following the December 2013 split within the ruling party. So this category of sanctions are aimed at stopping these internal conflicts. The second kind of sanction is sanctions aimed at pressuring governments to democratize or to respect human rights. This was a discussion that we had yesterday. This sanction is particularly interesting, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. The main target of this sanction is Zimbabwe. This sanction was not imposed by the United Nations. It was a sanction, a unilateral sanction by the United States and the European Union. And that sanction is still continuing. And the third kind of sanction is sanctions against coup d'etat that was trying to change government through a military coup. And the sanction in this case is a sanction imposed in 2012 on Guinea-Bissau. And I will talk about all this in relation to the degree to which they were effective later on. Now the question, of course, with all this, and there are a lot of other sanctions that I'm not even gonna talk about because the aim is similar. These are the three categories that generally sanctions in Africa operate. One point that I would like to mention is most of the sanctions are what you call targeted sanctions, usually military and armed embargo, but also economic sanctions dealing with individuals or entities in terms of asset freeze, travel ban, and that kind of sanction. Now, the first discussion, of course, when you talk about the sanctions is, are they effective? And we have been hearing about this yesterday and, of course, today. But there is one problem in relation to assessing sanctions, whether they are effective or not. Part of the reason why it is very difficult to assess is usually the literature starting from the 1960s when the sanction literature starts to emerge, assumes that effectiveness is measured by the degree to which a change in the behavior of the target country or entity has taken place. And most of that literature essentially concluded that sanctions are essentially meaningless. They did not make much difference in terms of the changing the behavior of the target country. Then came the second phase of the literature on sanctions, which was much more empirical, starting from about the 1980s, which tries to see if there is some kind of econometric model that you can build to tell you whether sanctions were effective. In fact, one of the interesting things, the conclusion of that particular literature was a little bit more optimistic than the first one, in the sense that they say it somehow works. It's not as effective, but as one of the authors suggested, about 34% of 20th century sanctions actually worked. Notice 34% means 66% didn't work. So then there was a lot of discussion about why does it work, where does it work, does it have any meaning in terms of the nature of the state and things of that sort. So, but the third phase essentially criticized the second phase of the literature, saying the methodology itself, this empirical methodology to try to determine whether sanctions are effective, is absolutely meaningless. It's meaningless. Also, the optimistic conclusion about sanctions is also meaningless. Now, more recent literature actually started to raise the issue of, I mean, are we really actually doing a meaningful study by asking the question of the degree of effectiveness of sanctions by looking at its effect on target variables? Because unless otherwise you have a very clear understanding of what the goals, the objectives of sanctions are, you cannot really measure whether they are successful or not. So comes a literature, a discussion that essentially says we need to look at differing goals of the sanction sender to see whether the sanctions was effective or not. And in that discussion, there are three goals. Presume there are the three goals where sanctions are imposed. One is what's called the target-related goals, meaning the earlier, analogous to the earlier literature, which essentially says, was there any change in the behavior of the target country? Now, again, even this is a little bit problematic because how do you measure the goals of the sanction sender? Because they could say something officially, but they might have something else in mind when they actually impose that particular sanction. So unless otherwise you have a specific analytical discussion about what the foreign policy of the country that is sending the sanctions are and what their multivariate objectives of the sanctions, you can really not measure what the target, even the target-related goals. But the second kind of goals that ought to be looked at is what's called the sender-related goals. I mean, the sender itself have a set of objectives in in relation to its own domestic constituency, why it particularly puts a sanction. Two of them that I can mention, the earlier discussion in the morning about Cuba, for example, says that the Cuba sanction is largely driven by the political imperatives in Miami and things of that sort, more than anything else in terms of. In relation to Africa, for example, the case of the Darfur sanction was because there was a large constituency in the United States pushing, we can't sit and watch this happen, we have to do something about it, and things like that. The feel-good kind of sanction, let's just do it. At least we feel that we are doing something about it. Now, of course, if you look at that, then measurement of success becomes meaningless because by definition, the minute you put a sanction, it is successful because you have appeased whatever domestic constituency is, therefore it was successful in relation to the sender. The third one, which I will be concentrating in my remarks a little bit later, is what's called system-related goals of sanctions. What they mean by system-related goals are that the attempt to establish what the rules of the game are in international behavior. What is considered to be a normal behavior? Or, who are the states that are not playing by the rules? And we need to make sure that these countries actually play by the rules. And of course, then you have a whole set of problems in relation to that because what are these norms? What are these norms that we are trying to establish as norms of behavior? Now, of course, one of the discussions about this is a norm established by international institutions such as the United Nations and things of that sort. But in this bifurcated world that we live in, could there be any agreed upon norm at the international level, or is it really the most powerful state in any particular moment that tries to define what the norms of behavior are in that particular? So these are the kinds of discussions, and the measurement of success or failure is going to be very much dependent upon which one you are looking at. So if we have this as a background, let me talk a little bit more about Africa. These sanctions imposed in African countries solve the stated objectives of the sanctions. Now, if the stated objectives in this case is to change the behavior of the target countries, the answer is 100% no. It didn't. Mugabe's behavior did not change because of the sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. The conflicts in Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo, or South Sudan is still going on, maybe at different levels. Coup d'etats still take place, not maybe as frequently as before, but so in relation to that target variable sanctions, they don't seem to have worked. So does this mean that sanctions are not working? Now, as an aside, if economic sanctions can work anywhere, precisely because of the weakness of the states and the dire economic needs that they have, it would have been in Africa. But even in Africa, it is not working in terms of changing the behavior of the targets. Now, so if we concentrate on the more system-related goals, which is are the required norms of behavior that we wish to establish, as designed by the dominant power, closely followed by countries in the region. Are countries now behaving in the way that the dominant power, in this case the United States, is suggesting is the normal behavior? Again, this is a very difficult question to answer, because if measures of success is the degree to which the rules of the game that are established by European powers, such as the EU and the US, as a new world order, if you will, is established as norms of behavior in the region, it is very difficult to tell because it is not clear what the expected norms of behavior are. What is the norms of behavior that are expected? Is there a very clear, consistent norms of behavior that are established? I will give you 4 possible norms that you hear in sanctions mentioned differently. First, for example, in the African case, mostly it is peaceful resolution of conflicts, right? So armored conflicts are bad. You have to find a way to solve whatever conflicts there are peacefully. So we'll slap sanctions on all parties that are involved in a conflict. Now, the question is, does it matter who started the conflict? Does it matter? Is there any moral principle to say that particular kinds of, Obama's just war kind of discussions? I mean, are there armed conflicts that are legitimate? Or are all armed conflicts illegitimate by today's norms of behavior? If democratization and respect for human rights is the norm that we want to establish, by whose standards? What do you mean by democratization and human rights? We all know it, but the way it is applied in different countries, is there really something that one would say there is a moral basis to claim that human rights violations and lack of democratization is a legitimate cause for sanctions? Or is it actually the kind of economic policies that countries pursue, right? I mean, is making the world a safe place for capitalism the more important value that we want to establish? Can countries, for example, have their own economic policies, even if it does not agree with the neoliberal policies that were established by the World Bank and the IMF? Is that a norm of behavior that countries are supposed to follow? Or is it, in general, being very friendly to the powers to be, like the United States? No matter what you are, you can be a dictator or whatever, but are you friendly to the United States? Is that really the measure of the values that we want to establish at the international level? I mean, these issues are not clearly set because both in terms of the intent of sanctions and the way they are implemented, it is so contradictory between countries, even within Africa. There are so many different countries that are all brutal. They're all, many of them, as brutal as they come, but some countries are affected by sanctions, others are not. So what is the basis upon which you claim that this is the norms of behavior that you want to establish? Now, to drive this point home, I want to talk a little bit about specific sanctions. One is the case of Zimbabwe. Now, if you look at the US website as to why sanctions were imposed on Zimbabwe in 2003, it says the United States implemented the target sanctions as a result of the actions and policies of certain members of the government of Zimbabwe and other persons undermining democratic institutions and processes in Zimbabwe. In other words, the reason why sanctions are imposed in Zimbabwe is because the Mugabe regime is not implementing democratic principles. In fact, the Congress, a year before that, implemented what's called the DERA, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, which essentially says that the United States should vote against any economic program by the IMF and the World Bank that goes to Zimbabwe. So then that's after that, the EU imposed sanctions in 2002, and then followed by the United States, the executive order. And on July 2008, this sanction was actually reinforced again with the claim that the 2008 elections in Zimbabwe were not free and fair, and therefore it is circumvention of the democratic process in Zimbabwe. Now, you look at that and say, okay, here the objective of sanction is to establish democratic norms in Zimbabwe. Then you sit down and say, but is Zimbabwe the only country that's not pursuing democratic politics and respecting human rights? And are there other countries in Africa that are doing the same but that do not have any sanctions? Now, to drive this point home, let me give you what the nature of the election was in 2008 in Zimbabwe. In 2008, the opposition, the MDC, led by Morgan Tsvangirai, in the first round won 47.9% of the votes. Actually, it was a plurality. While Mugabe's party won only 43.2%. So they have to go to a runoff election. During the runoff election, the opposition withdrew from that election because they felt there was too much violence and they could not. In that same election, for the parliamentary election, the opposition, both the MDC opposition, won the majority in parliament. That was the nature of that, that election. Now, in 2005, there was an election in Ethiopia. In the 2005 election, it was more or less established that the opposition have won that election. But that's not the most important point for my argument. Over 200 people were killed in that election. During the Zimbabwe one, maybe 2 or 3 people were killed. In the case of Ethiopia, 200 people were killed in that election. 30,000 people were imprisoned during that election. Over 200 leaders of the opposition were put in jail for 21 months. That election, compared to Zimbabwe's, looks much worse than anything that you can imagine has happened in Zimbabwe. Now, not only that, in 2010, after the 2005 election, the ruling party in Ethiopia won 99.6% of the votes, and that was considered a democratic election. In fact, 10 days ago, Wendy Sherman, the Assistant Secretary of State for Political Affairs, went to Ethiopia and says Ethiopia is a democratic country. I mean, she just declared that it is a democratic country. Right? The Washington Post had an editorial yesterday which essentially says this is the most rubbish thing that we have ever heard. Now, the reason why, of course, the United States said that has nothing to do with whether there is democracy or respect for human rights. I mean, Ethiopia is the second largest jailer of journalists in Africa. But that is certified as a democratic country that is not deserving any sanctions. But Zimbabwe is. So now, the point of it is then, of course, obviously, then it has nothing to do with democratization. I mean, so the sanctions on Zimbabwe has very little to do with whether Mugabe was a democrat or a dictatorship or things of that sort, because there are a dime a dozen in Africa when it comes to dictatorships. So the reason for the sanction in Zimbabwe, most would agree, is because what Mugabe did, which was considered terrible in terms of the US policy, which is, of course, he confiscated the land of white Rhodesians and redistributed it to his supporters, to Africans. Of course, you can imagine how contentious that is. I mean, so that sanction started with the UK, which was really pissed off by this act, but because they could not say this, they officially said this is about democratization and human rights. Now, Africans know this, and in fact, the effect of sanctions, in fact, the hardest sanction in African context took place on Zimbabwe. The effect on the economy was really devastating. I mean, it was, I think the only place that I have heard an inflation rate of 1,000,000% is in Zimbabwe after the sanctions. It was that bad. 3 million Zimbabweans, educated Zimbabweans left Zimbabwe because of sanctions. The opposition officially declared or asked the United States and the European Union to stop the sanctions because it is legitimizing Mugabe. I mean, Mugabe in the most recent election won 67%. From that 40-something, because the public saw what the sanction is all about. It is actually a sanction against white confiscation of lands. So, you know, if the value that is attempted here to be established is democratization or human rights, it obviously no African seriously considers this to be the case, because there are many, many other cases where they are much more brutal than, I mean, I'm not in any way saying that Mugabe is a Jeffersonian Democrat in any sense. I mean, he's a brutal dictator, but that's, the point is when you put a sanction inconsistently, then what happens is you lose the moral basis, the legitimacy issue of that sanction. The second kind of sanction, do I have some time? The second kind of sanction, which is, I also want to illustrate about what is the norm of behavior that we want to establish, is the Eritrean sanction, the case of the Eritrean sanction. The Eritrean sanction, which was imposed in 2009, essentially says Eritrea is interfering in the internal political conflict in Somalia, and therefore that is not a good behavior. And that has to be stopped. Now, what is interesting is there is another sanction in the DRC, UN Resolution 1493 in 2003, where very clearly a UN report clearly said that Uganda and Rwanda has been interfering in the Eastern Congo conflict, supporting the M23 rebels, which they support. And when the report was presented, actually Susan Rice officially told the committee not to put that report because these are friendly countries to the United States, which is Uganda and Rwanda. So then, of course, people ask, what is the basis upon which you can have one act committed by a set of countries that are friendly to the United States is okay, but another act by others that the United States doesn't like is not okay. So how do people take this? In fact, a very recent report by the Sanctions Committee on Eritrea says that one of the more recent activities of the Eritrean regime that led to the continuation of the sanctions was that the Eritrean government supports rebels in Ethiopia. Okay, so in doing so, it would destabilize the neighboring countries. Now, the interesting thing is that the Ethiopian government supports and arms armed rebels against the Eritrean regime too. But the sanction works on the case of Eritrea against Ethiopia, but not on Ethiopia against. So these are the kinds of things that start to raise a question about whether these sanctions have any moral, legitimate moral basis. The third one, as an example, is the coup in Guinea-Bissau. Again, the Guinea-Bissau military they're a bunch of crooks. That's not the question. But the objective is to stop coup d'etats. But as you know, a year ago, the Egyptians did a coup d'etat and there was no murmur. I mean, it was not even, in fact, in the US, there was an open decision not to call it a coup d'etat. Because if we call it a coup d'etat, then it would be, everybody knows it is a coup d'etat. So how is it that one coup d'etat is, a basis for sanction while the other is not? Again, this is not to say that one coup d'etat is good. It's just, do we have a consistent policy that then establish the norms of behavior, international norms of behavior? Now, so let me conclude briefly. So what measures the effectiveness of sanctions? And if we look forward, are sanctions going to be important instruments to establish certain norms of behavior, such as democratization and human rights respect and things of that sort? The question, again, that I think that we need to be very clear about is, are there any universal values that the international community agrees to that are worth sanctioning countries or entities for behaving in a certain way? Now, in our world today, with Russia and China and the rest of them, I don't think there is going to be any agreed upon behavior that we can establish to be the basis for justifying sanctions. But in the African case, even if there is no UN sanctions, this is what Andrew raised yesterday, if the legitimacy of sanctions is going to come from an international body, like the UN cannot agree, then what is the basis of the legitimacy? Let me just circumvent that to say, let's assume that there are certain agreed upon Western values that are worth implementing sanctions. Now the question is, are these Western values that are important to justify sanctions consistently applied to all countries so that the world at least says there are certain moral bases for these sanctions? When you don't have that kind of consistency, then of course the moral basis for this discussion becomes moot. And then the question becomes, whoever can live without this, you know, without being scratched by these sanctions, would survive. The question becomes winning. In the political arena in Africa, then the question becomes who wins. You know, if you win, no matter how you do it, once you win, then you are okay because you are a state. But what makes the situation even more difficult, I think, in the African case, and I personally believe that sanctions could be an important weapon, provided that we agree what these values are and we apply them consistently. But notice, with the economic muscle of the West weakening, with countries such as China and Russia asserting themselves, with the resources flowing from places like China becoming more and more important than the resources that are flowing from the West, I don't know how sanctions can be meaningful anymore, I mean, as we look forward. I mean, in the short run, still foreign aid is still big, so the United States can beat around some weaker countries, but even that is becoming less and less important because countries such as China and Russia are now coming out of the place without any political or other requirements. You know, you want money, you want to trade, that's fine. I don't care whether you are a dictator or a brute or whatever you are, so, because we are also that. So there is no basis to that. So I don't know how it's going to work in the future. Thank you.
We are joined by Todd Gitlin. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Arian, for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here among this very distinguished panelists. Great honor. So the conference title is Purse Power, and I define purse power as a power of containment. That's basically what it was during the Cold War, power of containment that George Kennan, one of the greatest American diplomats, put forward. And since today there's a lot of talk about the Cold War, I actually would like to evoke something that he used to say to me, surprise, surprise, actually it's still a surprise to me that I was his last research assistant in Princeton. So he often said that you Russians always look for grandiose victories and you need to look for small steps. And that's exactly what we're talking about, I think, in regard to sanctions, small steps. Moral they may be, moral they may be, moral they work in some places, not in other places, but these are small steps that in certain cases, which I believe Russia is one of those cases, is important. Vladimir Putin really for a decade and a half has wielded European dependence on Russia's natural gas as a foreign policy weapon. That was his sort of replacement of other versions of military might. And he really counted on European Union, particular fear that they will be without natural resources, Russia's supported natural resources, and his bluff was finally called. As you know, last week, which is, I think, was a very important act, European Union launched an antitrust case against the state-controlled conglomerate Gazprom, which one of my journalist friends in the 2000s used to say Gazprom is like North Korea. You ask them a question about policy and they just go silent. So finally, that North Korea is being called to questions. And that was a really very clear message that Putin's brutishness in that geopolitical weapon of oil and gas is no longer as intimidating as it once was. And so the question is, why now? Because this is a retrospective case, a retroactive case. It's about 2004, it's about 2008. Allegedly, supposedly has nothing to do with the current geopolitical situation. Of course, European Commission for Competition, also you may know a few weeks back, launched a similar antitrust case against Google. So you can also say that, well, there's a new commission and the new commission is just going after the big fish. Well, that perhaps is the case, and it's actually very interesting to read the Russian press because usually lately in the Russian press, America could do no right, or Europe could do no right, and suddenly Gazprom was being lumped together with Google as a champions in their fields, and how Europe was going after America and Russia once again in the Cold War play out of superpowers. You know, this conflating information is very, Russians are very good at, so it is interesting to see that suddenly America is a brother in fighting against Europe. But either way, I think the case against Russia, legal case against Russia, is interesting because it's the sanctions, I believe, brought it to the fore. As you know, the sanctions were imposed a year ago after the annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, and also Putin's continued aggression in East Ukraine. What happened with the sanctions, it is the economy stupid, because Russian economic output is expected to shrink by almost 4% this year, and it is due to sanctions. At least half of this number is due to sanctions. Also, those who follow very recently, sort of last spring and in last fall, Russian credit has been reduced to junk or near junk status by credit agencies. So all these things are very important. These are economic and political tools that are in fact effective. I mean, we can talk about the morality of those, and Putin talks about morality of sanctions at all times, saying that these are sort of the political way to undermine Russia, but nonetheless, in fact, it's the purse power that is very important here. So these are George Kennan's small steps that are in combination with other legal mechanisms. And Gazprom case, once again, I keep citing it because it's a very, very important case, because the message from the European Commissioner is finally that Russia needs to be competitive, and the rules apply to everyone, something that we talk, Professor Nega was talking about the systemic norms, so this is rules apply to everyone. The thing about Putin, great thing about Putin, in fact, I think a great thing about Putin is that he uses legalities as a measure of argument against everybody else. So whatever is being done to Russia is actually illegal in his view, such as sanctions, for example, because Russia means nothing more than asserting its known territory and basically being like every other great nation. So the way it has played out, not only in the international arena, but also at home, you may have followed and remember a very important case here a decade ago, the Kremlin opponent, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the head of the Yukos oil company. And it was a very big company, 20% of Russia's output came from it. So the Kremlin jailed Khodorkovsky for 10 years. And the accusations were tax evasion. It wasn't something really political, although of course it was very political, but it was just simple tax evasion. So Putin is really great at playing these legal rules, and he is, mind you, those who don't remember, he is actually a lawyer by training, so that's important to remember. So he does use law in a very creative way. And it was an important case because also all other players in Russia's energy-centric economy sort of fall into place and fall in line politically, fell into their own places, and Putin was able then to kind of manipulate the oil market and gas market and use it as natural resources, geopolitical weapons. And one of the things that Gazprom, the anti-Gazprom antitrust case against Gazprom is now looking at is how it has been manipulated in the 2000s. So what are the sort of oil and gas hikes, especially gas hikes in Europe, because Europe was dependent or is dependent on Russian gas. Viktor Orban, who has become an incredible friend of Putin, which is rather interesting, European Union country, one of the first to get rid of the Soviet rule in 1989, is suddenly back in that orbit. So Orban is great Putin supporter and friend, and Hungary pays Gazprom $260 per 1,000 cubic meter of gas, which is remarkable because Poland, who has been consistently critical of Putin, is paying 526, which is the highest price in EU. Britain and Germany somewhere in the middle in the 300s, and the European Union average is 380. So you could see that from 260 to 500, that is really a weapon here. So the Poles do pay a steep price, but in some ways what really has been shown in the last year that they have been right. And like Malaysian airline flight MH17, remember it fell down tragically in July in East Ukraine, and it really became the beginning of the end of Russia's reputation, well, as it was, of a civilized country. So cases at the time, what's important, along with sanctions, the legal cases came into play. So these cases were dormant for years or were not put forward for years. One of the cases, which was an important case to mention here, is back in the news now. It's the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, a dissident ex-KGB officer who was Putin's colleague for some while, his lawyers, Litvinenko's lawyers, claim that the evidence of his assassination in London in 2007 actually lead to Putin's doorsteps. But nonetheless, actually, British Home Office last year, 2 years ago, declared there would be no inquiry. And suddenly, after Malaysian flight, that inquiry was open and, in fact, is underway in London right now. So all this is happening with economic pressure on Russia as a background, and countries and European Commission really coming back with legal accusations or legal cases and just basically taking page from Putin's playbook. One of the cases that is also very important to consider, I mentioned Khodorkovsky, and Khodorkovsky case is back, once again also is back in play because European Court on Human Rights declared that as much as we, or they, would think that this is really not a fair way Khodorkovsky was treated going to jail, yet they really didn't go after Putin or after the state. And yet last summer, right once again after MH17 flight downing, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, and I have to say it's sort of a bit of a poetic justice theory here because that Malaysia flight left Holland, and that ruling in The Hague was sort of a slight sweet victory for them because 200 people were actually Dutch citizens who lost their lives on that flight. So the court in The Hague ruled that Russia must pay $50 billion to UCOS shareholders now. So it has been, Khodorkovsky's UCOS was collapsed in 2003, 2004, and 11 years later, so finally we came back, and they came back and announced that, in fact, this Putin should pay for that. And just for some information, this penalty is a very steep one because it represents about 204% of Russia's gross domestic product. So it's a very expensive, very, very expensive case if it is to be paid. Now Russia has appealed the decision, but the expectation will be actually upheld on appeal. So Ukraine-related sanctions already shaved close to 2% of Russian GDP. So all these things put together really put quite a damper on the economy, and once again deliver a very strong message that rules do apply to everyone. And these cases are retroactive, so they can claim that there's nothing to do with Ukraine, and yet there is something to do with Ukraine. Interesting thing, once again, to, when we talk about Africa, how there's a moral issue here. Gazprom was never touched by sanctions. I mean, it's touched by the legal cases, but no, it was never sanctions. All other companies were, I mean, not all, many companies were, many chairs of those companies were, but Gazprom was never touched. And in some ways, it really fell into that category of too big to fail. So if we touch Gazprom, what's going to happen to European oil and gas? Because for Europe, it would be very difficult right away to withstand the 30% cut in deliveries from Russia. Another thing to consider here, that Russia is a much greater danger right now, precisely because 70% of Russia's export comes from of natural resource exports. And just for, once again, for comparison, Gazprom revenues alone account to 5% of the Russian national budget, which is a lot of money. So Gazprom and the Russian state really are much less capable, increasingly less capable of withstanding the loss of the European market as they tried, I mean, as Putin tried to do in the last 15 years. So China, I mean, China was mentioned here. I mean, China does drive a very hard bargain with Russia, understanding that Putin really is in a very desperate search right now for alternative buyers. And so really cutting exports to Europe on his terms would be exceedingly unwise for him. So to conclude, the moment of truth, I believe, for Russia is approaching. It's slowly approaching, but slowly Russia is big and has a long history, so slowly can take a while. In one of the conversations one time I had with Lawrence O'Donnell, MSNBC evening host, anchor, he said, well, sanctions are not working because we want Putin on his knees, and he's not on his knees. And I was like, well, good luck with that. So it is possible and likely that Putin will not get on his knees. However, as you know, the West may not take Crimea back from Russia. Actually, I don't think it will take Crimea back from Russia, sanctions or no sanctions or any legal means in this particular case. But you know what? Putin is not going to Kiev, which is incidentally quite an achievement. He says he never wanted to, but given an opportunity, he probably would have. And today is a really good moment for the world to kind of take pause and think that one of the reasons it is, in fact, this kind of fragile balance is in place is because there is an understanding that the world does, Europe needs to refuse, reduce its dependence on volatile energy supplies, and Russia is one of them. So fracking, we can debate whether fracking is a good thing or a bad thing, but it is being considered. New technologies, other markets like Australia, Norway, Qatar, and whatnot. So really, what really has happened, I think, in the last year, and particularly with Gazprom case, and particularly since last summer in MH17, that Putin has been increasingly held accountable for his actions. Once again, Crimea may not go back to Ukraine, and not that I'm insisting that never will, but at some point it might, but not in the near future. However, what I believe sanctions have done, and especially legal actions based on what sanctions had brought Russian economy to, is that Putin is put on notice, and his strong-arm tactics will really not be working for much longer. But Russia has a long history. Much longer is not 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes. Welcome. You were already introduced.
Ah, good. Good.
You said only good things about it.
I appreciate that. Happy May Day. Many people support the BDS movement, hoping to register a strong protest against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. I share their horror at the occupation. I have opposed it as vigorously as possible, written against it, spoken against it for decades. I've done so in the US, and I've done so in Israel, and at times to the faces of its supporters. But BDS is a wrong turn toward a virtuous goal, namely heightening effective pressure on Israel to abandon the occupation in favor of a just and sustainable peace. Boycotts and divestments appeal to ideals of citizenship. Vote with your money. Make perpetrators of injustice pay a price. Raise the stakes so that when they get their calculating minds around a cost-benefit analysis, they decide the cost is too steep. Often such campaigns have been constructive. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, triggered by Rosa Parks, succeeded in convincing the authorities to end racial segregation there. The city knew just what it had to do to end the boycott. It had to stop shunting blacks onto the back of the bus. In the end, the courts ordered desegregation, and the city buses, with new seating arrangements, rolled. The bus system, having conceded, continued. In 1965 to 70, an alliance of the Mexican-American-led National Farm Workers Association and the Filipino-American-led Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee cast anathema on the fruit of the vine in order to make agribusiness recognize the union's collective bargaining rights. For lovers of grapes, there was a sacrifice, but also a glow. What you lost in the tapes of grapes, you gained in the sweetness of virtue. In 1976 through 79, the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union organized a boycott of the J.P. Stevens Company. This textile company, one of the largest, had been systematically denying workers' rights, violating laws with impunity. New York then Lieutenant Governor-elect Mario Cuomo at that time urged Americans, and I quote, to shun the products of J.P. Stevens as you would shun the fruit of an unholy tree, close quote. The movie Norma Ray, which is always worth looking at, celebrated striking workers and organizers during that period. In the end, the company signed an agreement with the union. Those were reform boycotts. They harnessed anger into improvements on the ground. The cause was just, and the means fit the ends. In the case of grapes, the premise was that the workers who harvested the grapes were entitled to collective recognition to improve their condition. Unstated but assumed was that the growers of the vines, or the owners more accurately, had the right to own the workers. And the boycott ended when the owners recognized the union. The owners still owned the vines. There remained two parties to continuing disputes, which if you were a militant, you might call the class struggle, and if you were not, you might call labor management relations. As for divestment, this is another way to vote with your money. The movement to make universities and pension funds and so on divest from corporations involved in apartheid South Africa from the 1970s through the 1980s had a more radical objective: to force an end to apartheid by making it economically untenable. I was involved in that movement twice over as a professor at the University of California Group Faculty for Full Divestment, and as an alumnus of Harvard, where we were running a campaign to elect pro-divestment members of their board of overseers. No one in the American movement ever proposed to blacklist South African professors. There were some exceptions in Britain, though unlike divestment, they had no palpable effect. The objective of this campaign was to further the creation of a unitary, non-racial, democratic state in which perforce black, so-called colored, and so-called Asian Africans would predominate and racial inequality would no longer be legal. The objective was not to drive the whites into the sea or back to Holland or Great Britain, respectively. Presently, I'm involved in the alumni wing of a group called Divest Harvard, which is a student-run campaign to press the university to sell holdings in fossil fuel corporations whose business model is to make civilization untenable by burning carbon and dumping the byproducts into the atmosphere with public subsidy. And also, I'm involved in an equivalent movement at Columbia and Barnard as a faculty member, where I helped draft a letter recently signed by more than 300 faculty and staff advocating fossil fuel divestment. There are several hundred other university campaigns of this sort, with some colleges, churches, cities, and foundations following suit. One of our sponsors here, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, after years of trying to get some movement out of so-called engagement with the heads of oil companies, about 6 months ago decided to divest themselves. The object of all these campaigns is to stigmatize those corporations and to further the development of energy sources that the earth can abide. All these movements have been tied to practical objectives, some more radical than others. Their justifications lie in a sheer disproportion of rights. The rights of the Negro passengers and the grape pickers and the Stevens workers and the South African majority were not comparable to the rights of the segregationists or the growers or the South African white minority. In a sense, the fossil fuel movement today has more radical ends, since the present movement, if we had divine powers, would put fossil fuel companies out of business altogether. But in none of these cases was or is there a clash of right against right. The rights of posterity to a livable planet trump the rights of the owners of ExxonMobil or BP or Shell and so on to their profits. It's not a close call. Other campaigns, however, channel anger into postures of virtue that detract from a just end. They demand not changes of policy, but the disappearance of one party. There are people of goodwill, Arabs, Jews, whatever, who support the BDS movement for boycotts and divestments against Israel, either because they think it can push Israel to make concessions to Palestinians, or because they want the state of Israel to go away. Their passion to press the state of Israel to abandon the occupation of the West Bank and to encourage de facto the emergence of a Palestinian state that would live side by side with a majority Jewish state, I devoutly share. The death toll and destruction caused by Israeli attacks on Gaza last summer did nothing to weaken the case that Israel's defense needs do not justify wholesale destruction and everyday victimization. Still in all, many supporters of BDS do not understand or have not thought through just what they are subscribing to. Consider the 2005 BDS call by Palestinian organizations, which can be read on the official BDS website. It favors, I quote, broad boycotts and divestment initiatives against Israel, similar to those applied to South Africa in the apartheid era, which, it goes on to say, quote, should be maintained until Israel meets its obligation to recognize the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination and fully complies with the precepts of international law by, and there are then 3 items in their list. Number 1, ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. 2, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. And 3, respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194, close quote. Now, let's leave aside for now the fact that the BDS organizers are highly selective about the international obligations they wish to enforce at the cost of, among other things, academic freedom. They do have a point when they say that all campaigns are partial and selective, though one might well marvel at their insouciance when it comes to the slaughter perpetrated next door by Bashar al-Assad. But leave aside the sleight of hand also with which these supporters claim that their boycott, which actually I think is better known as, would be better called a blacklist, targets only Israeli institutions and not individuals. But the BDS goals are slippery in a way that hasn't been sufficiently understood. The first statement I read, the first of the 3 demands, refers to the colonization of all Arab lands. Which ones are those? According to Hamas, they include the entirety of the state of Israel. Is this the policy of BDS? And if not, why does it speak of all Arab lands? Moreover, the phrase is coded to imply that the very existence of the state of Israel, as recognized in 1948, is what constitutes colonization. If that were not so, It would suffice to say in the occupation, meaning the occupation that took place and continues to take place as a result of the 1967 war and the Jewish-Israeli settlements that continue illegally to expand on the West Bank. To BDS, the original sin would seem to be the founding of the Israeli state in the first place. So the language masks the desire of one of the parties to the horrendous Israel-Palestinian conflict that the other one disappear. But one nation's desire that another one disappear deserves no support. As a spasmodic reaction to violence, indignity, and humiliation, it is all too human. As a political position, it is a moral disaster. It is not politics. It is a tantrum and perhaps a lethal one. One might even say a theology. Moving to point number 2 on the BDS list, the human rights of the Palestinians in Israel are surely in need of defense, and a campaign toward that end is wholly justified. Why in Israel fending off sanctions and boycotts would be more likely to honor Palestinian rights escapes me. What is the evidence that, as the BDS movement has gained ground, Israeli treatment of its Arab majority has improved? To the contrary. As for point 3, the innocent reader will likely be unaware that UN Resolution 194, cited there, is highly contested. One line of argument notes that 194 does not proclaim an unconditional right of return, but rather affirms that, and I quote, "The refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return, and for loss of or damage to property which should be made good by the governments or authorities responsible." Close quote. Another line of argument is that 194 has actually been rendered obsolete by events. For example, it also calls for United Nations control of Jerusalem, which has been a moot point for decades. And in particular, that the right of return stipulated in 194 was superseded by the better-known Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967, which calls for a, quote, just settlement of the refugee problem. I do not propose to wade into legal exegesis. My point is that the BDS call goes far beyond expressing outrage at the systematic Israeli mistreatment of Palestinians, anger for which, I want to repeat, there is ample warrant. It mobilizes that anger toward a most particular idea about how to settle relations between two peoples by enfolding one under the dominance of another. Unlike all proposals for just settlements of the murderous ethnic wars of our time, for example, Rwanda, former Yugoslavia, Kashmir, it demands that one of those peoples give up the state in which they predominate. In the endgame envisioned by BDS, one set of pieces is left on the board and the other is removed. So without doubt, BDS looks like a plausible feel-good proposition for people who are weary of endless bloodshed. It is not a feel-good proposition for the victims of a blacklist. The Israeli academics whose scholarly publications and collaborations and research trips to the United States, BDS proposes to halt. Or to the scholars who are, under BDS's principles, to be forbidden access to Israeli archives. BDS is not a practical proposition to raise the price Israel must pay for the occupation by demanding, say, that the US cut aid to Israel that goes to sustain and enlarge the occupation, or that American-based foundations that further the occupation be notified by the IRS that they do not have the right to claim tax deductions for this work, and so on. BDS is not focused on unjust practices like divestment from or sanctions against particular corporations that sustain the occupation, like the 3 companies that were divested last year by a narrow vote of the Presbyterian Church. What BDS wants, rather, is categorical. It's absolute. It knows only one set of wrongs, not another. It proclaims that there is but one story to be told of the Middle Eastern tragedy, and it is theirs. This is not politics. This is Manichaean theology. To forbid contacts between members of conflictual powers is to erase what people in universities like this one have to offer. It's a gesture of disgust. It's a paroxysm of rage. Like Hamas's rockets from Gaza, it makes Israelis feel embittered and embattled, and this does not put them in a mood to act more justly. It hardens their will to listen to no one. Who benefits from such an outcome? As Noam Chomsky, who cannot be accused of tenderness toward the Jewish state, has argued, it's not the Palestinians. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Last week, the Israeli Supreme Court issued another decision that upheld anti-democratic legislation and policies with minor modification. The court upheld the law making calls, public calls for boycott of institutions associated with the State of Israel a civil wrong, to which now it's better. So last week, the Israeli Supreme Court made a decision that upheld the law that makes public calls to boycott the institutions associated with the State of Israel as a civil wrong, to which the scholars or activists can be held liable and sued if damages are proven. So as an Israeli citizen, I can be sued if I argue for a boycott and then harm is being established. A non-Israeli can also be sued by this law if he or she made the call on either Israeli territory or a territory controlled by Israel. The law does not make a distinction between the settlements, between Israel proper and the occupied territories. So a call for boycotting the settlements is also a civil legal wrong. So despite the chilling effects of the law on political speech, I'll try to be as clear as I can. I will try to do that without any theological tantrum. A couple of months ago, my academic institution, SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London, initiated a referendum on the question of boycotting Israeli academic institutions. And the vote, 73% of the faculty and the students supported the termination of institutional links with Israeli academic institutions, as I was one of those who supported that decision. So in my talk, I will focus somewhat heavily on the analogy to the apartheid, given what we heard yesterday, and I will respond eventually on to some of the critiques of the BDS movement and the skepticism towards it. So what is BDS? The judge who wrote the decision on the boycott law, the majority opinion, the ruling, described the call for boycott as an act of political terror. Another judge quoted the Passover Haggadah in order to argue that it's justifiable to restrict the rights of those who are trying to annihilate the Jewish people. This extreme and right-wing rhetoric in the court is consistent with the right-wing shift in Israel since 1977. When the Supreme Court approves that kind of law with that kind of rhetoric, then it's no longer Netanyahu, Bennett, and Lieberman only to blame. BDS is a rights-based approach. It's based on international law. It's a non-violent method of struggle. It's a call to civil society to act. It's a call for solidarity. It's a tactic, not a strategy. It's a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. And for me, it's less about moral outrage as much as political activism. And admittedly, like the South African call for boycott, it seeks to isolate the unjust state and to stigmatize it. How can that be described as an act of political terror? How can that be described as annihilation or as Hamas rockets? So I want to suggest two primary reasons for that kind of hyperbole. One is political instrumentality, a discourse of impunity, and the second is ideological. So on the one hand, this discourse that seeks to delegitimize the BDS movement is consistent with a discourse of impunity. This is a discourse that frames the PA's application to the UN for membership and recognition of state as an act of political terror, and also rejects the PA's application to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. This is the same discourse that successfully killed the Goldstone report a few years ago, and therefore effectively paved the way for the subsequent heavy bombardment of densely populated civilian neighborhoods in Gaza. All these are non-violent and rights-based approaches. Shouldn't those who lament the tragedy, quote unquote, and denounce violence be supportive of them? In fact, this discourse of impunity is seeking to absolve Israel of any accountability for any wrongdoing. It doesn't seem to matter for those critics of BDS how far right-wing Israeli society and government become. And it doesn't seem to matter how the internal mechanisms of accountability, like the Supreme Court in Israel, are not well functioning. Some of those who are critical of Netanyahu nevertheless share his views on BDS and these other measures taken by the Palestinians. They are also part of the discourse of impunity. But I want also to suggest that there is another reason for that, which is that they share a basic vision of Jewish supremacy. They only disagree on how far to discriminate against the non-Jewish natives and how far to go in dispossessing the Palestinians and by which methods. The reason why the Supreme Court judge used the language of annihilation is that for the Jewish majority in Israel, the ideological project of a Jewish state totally overlaps with the state as an institutional structure. So in other words, Israel can exist in this vision only as a Jewish supremacy. No Jewish supremacy, no Israel. The BDS calls for the end of the occupation, the end of discrimination against Palestinian citizens, and the return of the refugees. All these are based on international law. The reason for rejecting full equality for the Palestinians inside Israel is the same reason for rejecting the right of return of the refugees. Full equality of the Palestinian citizens means that there are no privileges accorded to the Jews in Israel only. The return of the refugees means that the ethno-national religious control by the Jewish majority on the state institutions would not be as firm as it is right now. In a state of all its citizens, in which no one is discriminated against because of their nationality, religion, or origin, you should not care who is the majority. Fears of the tyranny of the majority is solved by constitutional structures. Similarly, a large part of the white majority in South Africa saw the privileges accorded to them by apartheid as intertwined with the state, i.e., they saw the preservation of these privileges as existential. Yet, apartheid was dismantled and South Africa remained. Now, of course, many see the analogy to apartheid as mistaken, so let me address this point in the coming few minutes. In Israel, the so-called constitutional revolution in the 1990s deliberately excluded the principle of equality from the Bill of Rights. And subsequently, the Knesset rejected many attempts by Arab lawmakers to introduce the principle of equal protection of the laws into the Israeli Book of Laws. For example, on January 23, 2002, Tzipi Livni, a so-called centrist, urged members of the Knesset to reject an equal protection clause, according to which equality is the right of every citizen in the state, regardless of his or her nationality, religion, or views. The majority of the Knesset at that time and other subsequent times rejected the proposed bill, and formal equality remains outside the Book of Laws. While the apartheid court in South Africa in 1982 in a case called Kumanino versus Bantu administration protected the right of blacks to family life and struck down governmental regulations that violated it, the Israeli Supreme Court upheld twice, in 2006 and 2012, the law banning family unification. Palestinian citizens, and only them, cannot naturalize their spouses inside Israel if those spouses were residents of the Palestinian territories or other adjacent countries. Effectively, I can't marry half of the Middle East. At the time of the Palestinian community grew from 156,000 in 1948 to 1.4 million today, an extensive Israeli legislative and judicial project expropriated the land, most of the privately owned lands of the Palestinian citizens. These policies transformed the Palestinian citizens into unskilled, manual, and relatively unprotected labor who were incorporated into a racially segmented labor market and who reside in overcrowded, poor communities. More than 90% of the Palestinian citizens inside Israel live in separate Arab communities. Israeli law legalizes segregation in housing and allocation of land through admission committees that screen out socially incompatible candidates. The Israeli Supreme Court upheld the law recently. This housing segregation goes hand in hand with the segregation in education. The government runs two segregated Arab and Jewish education systems and relegates the Arab education system to an inferior status. 99% of the Palestinian students inside Israel study in the Arab education system, and only 34% graduate from high school. Given the deficient infrastructure and lack of decent education and employment opportunities, the rate of Arab women employment inside Israel is lower than Saudi Arabia and Oman. 54% of the Palestinian families inside Israel are poor. 66% of the Palestinian children inside Israel are poor. Under these conditions, high levels of crime and organized crime are unsurprising. Although the Palestinians inside Israel are 18% of the population, they are 50% of the criminal prisoners, 67% of the murder suspects, and 70% of the attempted murder suspects. Therefore, the state produced concentrated poverty in racially segregated areas and prevented social and spatial mobility. This leads to transforming Arab communities into areas of high crime, poor schools, high mortality rates, and welfare-dependent residents. In other words, they become ghettos. Now, this process of ghettoization intersects with a process of Bantustanization in the West Bank and Gaza. First, Israel has de facto annexed the West Bank in addition to de jure annexing East Jerusalem. According to estimates, Israel invested more than $100 billion in a Jewish-only infrastructure in the West Bank, and Israeli presence amounts to 59% of the West Bank. Secondly, legally, Israel never recognized its status as an occupying power and refused to apply the Geneva Conventions except the so-called humanitarian provisions. And it's the longest military occupation since World War II. Thirdly, Israel integrated the West Bank into its legal system, the tax system, labor laws, and more recently, the penal code, to mention a few examples. Four, Israel fragmented the West Bank into non-contiguous areas with racially segregated populations, imposing two different sets of laws, different roads, and even different buses. In other words, Israel created Bantustans. Thus, both inside Israel's Green Line and in the occupied territories, the Palestinians are relegated into a separate and unequal status, i.e. they are under an apartheid regime. Now, why is the apartheid analogy apt? And I say analogy, not identity. First, South Africa, recall, was not a totalitarian state. It had a competitive multi-party system. Secondly, the Group Areas Act of 1955 denationalized millions of blacks who were granted self-government or independence, and this is analogous to this Oslo process. Thirdly, South Africa was not a system with absolute prohibitions. In fact, there were exemptions. For instance, the so-called Section 10 blacks, blacks who were born before a certain date, were exempted from carrying passes. In addition, the regime distinguished between blacks who resided in the Bantustans and blacks who were allowed to reside outside the Bantustans. Four, and more importantly, coloreds and Indians were allowed to reside in white areas and had better conditions than blacks. And after the constitutional reforms in 1983, they had full political rights as well as property rights. Thus, the fact that the Palestinians inside Israel can vote does not ameliorate the Israeli case. The apartheid regime was a combination of different degrees of oppression against different groups at different times, including, by the way, the occupation of Namibia for about 19 years. And the same goes for Israel. Now, I know that some reject the analogy and BDS because they think that in this case, unlike other boycott cases, there is a struggle between two rights, a right versus a right. However, I think they posit a false symmetry despite the gross asymmetry of power. This symmetry has been challenged in the South African context. For example, Martha Meno, the Dean of Harvard Law School, reflecting on the reconciliation processes in South Africa, wrote, quote, "Crucial here would be demonstrable even-handedness and honest acknowledgement of injuries and wrongs committed by the competing sides without losing hold of the distinction between those who abused government power and those who resisted the abuses. The very effort to articulate the moral baseline must treat the apartheid crimes as worse than the crimes of the ANC or other anti-apartheid activists in terms of scale and motive," unquote. To be clear, by actions committed by those who resisted the abuses in the context of South African apartheid, we mean actions that Nelson Mandela himself labeled as sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and terrorism. We also mean internal fighting amongst blacks. Thousands of blacks lost their lives in that kind of violence. There is nothing wrong with critiquing some forms of Palestinian violence, but those who impose a moral equivalence between Israeli and Palestinian actions mislead themselves and others. This deception is a good excuse for lack of action or even a clear condemnation of a stronger party. Now, the apartheid analogy has been used by many Israeli and South African policymakers. For example, in 1961, Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of the grand apartheid vision of the Panelist, said, quote, "The Jews took Israel from the Arabs after the Arabs had lived there for 1,000 years. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state," unquote. In 1976, the South African Prime Minister John Vorster, who was arrested during World War II for Nazi sympathies, officially visited Israel. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin at the time made statements about shared ideals of the two countries and a similar situation of facing foreign enmity. Later, a few months later, the South African official yearbook stated, quote, "Israel and South Africa have one thing above all else in common. They are both situated in a predominantly hostile world inhabited by dark peoples," unquote. This is the period when security cooperation between the states was at its peak. Israeli-made anti-riot vehicles were deployed in black townships. Israel was also one of the few states in the world to open an embassy for a Bantustan. In 2003, former Italian Prime Minister Massimo D'Alema said that Prime Minister Sharon told him that the Bantustan model was the most appropriate solution to the conflict with the Palestinians. Of course, also activists against apartheid like Ronnie Kasri and Desmond Tutu also made the analogy. Kasri said, quote, "This is much worse than apartheid. The Israeli measures, the brutality, make apartheid look like a picnic. We never had jets attacking our townships. We never had sieges that lasted month after month. We never had tanks destroying houses. We had armored vehicles and police using small arms to shoot people, but not on this scale," unquote. So let me conclude with some final thoughts on BDS and respond to some of the critiques. Another similarity between the South African campaign and the Palestinian one is that they are both controversial, giving rise to debates both within and outside the movement. Back then, conservative and right-wing movements and governments opposed the boycott of the apartheid and called for constructive dialogue, if you would recall Margaret Thatcher, for example. The arguments that they used are strikingly similar to the ones we hear today from opponents of BDS. They said, among other things, "You are singling out South Africa. Boycott is alienating and counterproductive. There are worst human rights offenders. The whites modernized the country after they found it barren and unpopulated, and that the blacks under apartheid had better lives than elsewhere in the continent because apartheid raised their literacy rates and health standards, and that if you give them the vote, it will be a one-time vote." If you want to see an example, Google the Christian Science Monitor on the 12th of October, an editorial called "South Africa Should Not Be Singled Out." Is BDS counterproductive because it blocks communication and dialogue? In the age of social media, blocking communication is not something realistic. Instead, the question is, what kinds of communication are encouraged and discouraged? All forms of communication exist within a context of power relations. We cannot ignore that fact. BDS seeks a political, legal, and economic pressure to have a more equal communication. Is BDS counterproductive because it hurts the left wing in Israel? Since 1977, the right wing is getting stronger and stronger in Israel. In 2001, Ehud Barak basically killed the left. The left is in decline in shambles in Israel because of the right-wing turn, not because of the BDS. They are silenced by the growing McCarthyism inside Israel, as we saw during the last war, not because of BDS. Also, they are not boycotted personally, as they are frequently invited to talks outside Israel, including in SAWAS. Is BDS singling out Israel? In a conference like this, I shouldn't really spend any time on this argument, as we have been talking for 2 days on multiple cases of sanctions divestment in different countries. In any case, boycott and divestment is a tactic, not a strategy. It's a political tool that is used whenever it can be effective. Israel is a small country that is trade dependent, and therefore it might be effective. It is a means to the end of realizing political rights. The leader of the ANC, Walter Cicelo, made these kinds of points back in 1957 in the magazine Liberation. In addition, the fact that there are other human rights offenders is not an argument for targeting either everyone or no one. A human rights offender cannot be let off the hook simply by pointing at other human rights offenders. Moreover, it is Israel that singles itself out by claiming to be the only democracy in the Middle East. You cannot make that kind of argument and then expect to be compared to non-democratic states around. And it's also the United States that singles out Israel for a special treatment and through the annual military aid and the protection in the Security Council by using the veto, making Israel the largest recipient of military aid, of US military aid. Finally, Israel is being targeted in response to a call from Palestinians themselves, just like the South African call. The response that there were other bad countries in Africa was not convincing against the ANC call at the time, and it shouldn't be convincing against the BDS call during this time. Let me close by a quote from the Pittsburgh Gazette, 26th of November, 1977, written by Johan Adler, who served at the time as the South African Deputy Consul General in New York. One is speechless at the audacity of calling South Africa a politically schizophrenic state, a prison and a dictatorship for blacks and a democracy for whites. Surely, a state which is prepared to confer self-government on each of its ethnic black groups, which is prepared to propose a new parliamentary structure to include the Asian and the colored population groups, which has appointed a cabinet committee to investigate circumstances of the urban black, which has called for the creation of elected community councils for urban blacks, which has raised the literacy rate of its black people above that of any other African state, which has amended the controversial passbook system, which has the highest per capita black income in Africa, which has just at a time of economic recession voted an additional $287 million for low-cost housing in non-white residential areas. Surely, such a state is neither schizophrenic, nor dictatorial, nor a prison. If you are convinced by this kind of rhetoric, then Israel is not an apartheid. If you are not, then you should support the BDS. Thank you.
Thank you.